We're going to be in Nehemiah chapter 5 in our study of Ezra and Nehemiah. What's been going on in the land of Judah so far? Refresh my memory. Okay, building the wall. That's the main thing, isn't it? So far, well, in Nehemiah anyway. Lots of opposition in the process. They've been having to deal with that. And that opposition came from the outside. What we're going to be seeing today in chapter 5 is really an even worse situation, or more unfortunate, is that there were also problems, it seems, within. And that's what pops up here in chapter 5, maybe sort of abruptly, it may seem to us. But as they had been working on that wall, and it was going great, notwithstanding the opposition, but as far as from their perspective and overall, they were all united. It was very encouraging. We read how the people had a mind to work, and how important that is in any endeavor, really. And so here they are. That's what's going on. And the progress was being made, and they finished. We read in the next chapter, actually, that they finish the wall, but they're in that process. And the unity that they had was a blessing, and it was really encouraging and uplifting for any of God's people to see what happens when that unity exists, or what can happen and how things can be. Great things can be accomplished. But what we learn here in chapter 5 is that while they were united in the matter of building the wall, that is not to say that they were united in everything. Not all was going well. Not all was perfect or peachy. There were other issues that were going on, and Nehemiah eventually found out about these things, and he's going to have to deal with them. In fact, he was not pleased at all to hear about these things, and we'll see how he dealt with that. He did it in an upright way. It's once again, Nehemiah serves as an example for not only leaders, but anybody who may find themselves in a position of having to resolve conflict between people. I would say the number one thing is always, what is the right thing? What is the right thing? And that's the thing that needs to be done. Regardless of anything else, there is always a right thing to do. And even if there are multiple right things that can be done, then there will always be a best or better of the right things to do. In this case, it wasn't so much multiple right things, but we may think that there was, but that's another reason why this is such a good example for us, is to see how Nehemiah dealt with it. So here's what was going on. We read here, we finished chapter 4 last week, and then in chapter 5, all of a sudden, here's what we read. Now there arose a great outcry of the people and of their wives against their Jewish brothers. That sets the stage. Already something's not right here, is it? An outcry arose of the Jews against their brothers. Red flag already. But we go further. It says, for there were those who said, with our sons and our daughters, we are many. So let us get grain that we may eat and keep alive. There were also those who said, we are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our houses to get grain because of the famine. Verse 4 says there were those, sort of three categories, if you will, who said, we have borrowed money for the king's tax on our fields and our vineyards. Now our flesh is as the flesh of our brothers. Our children are as their children. Yet we are forcing our sons and our daughters to be slaves, and some of our daughters have already been enslaved. But it is not in our power to help it, for other men have our fields and our vineyards. This was the situation that Nehemiah discovered was going on among the people. At a time that's not exactly clear as far as the timeline goes. Some people say this must have happened after the wall was finished. That's not necessarily true. That doesn't have to be the case. It could have happened. It could have been something that had been going on for a while, but just went under the radar until it got bad enough that it came to his attention. But either way, it was happening. When it was happening is pretty much irrelevant. So 3 things here it says about the outcry. Some of them were saying, in the simplest of ways, we need food. Then he says, there were some who said, we've been having to mortgage our fields. We've had to, I think is the correct tense or whatever, the way that this should be worded is, the idea is that they've already done it. The ones that were saying this. This is something that we've had to do. Mortgage our fields and our vineyards and our houses just to be able to get grain, to get food. Some people attack the mention of a famine here because it comes out of nowhere. Famine, we weren't even told about a famine. But there is some who suggest that the word famine there isn't necessarily to be indicative in this context as a famine like the one that was going on in Genesis with Jacob and his family. But the word could be translated in a way that just indicates they themselves were starving. They were in extreme hunger. Not that it was as simple as our crops are insufficient and so there's a great famine over the land, but we ourselves are suffering famine because we don't have any food. But that's just a side note because the famine is one reason why people attack the timeline and whatnot. And then there was a third class, if you want to call it a class, or maybe a third tier step. People have been having to borrow money just to pay the king's tax on the fields and the vineyards. So some were, I guess, maybe the poorest. They just wanted food, period. And it may indicate, the second group or class may indicate that they pledged their fields and stuff in order to get food, but they were still not getting the food. And so they were needing that. And then there were those who hadn't yet had to mortgage their fields, but they're having to borrow money just to be able to pay the tax on the fields. So financially, things were not in great shape. And in a fellowship way, things were not in great shape. And in verse 5, it's basically just saying they're reasoning out that, and there's clearly a rich and poor dynamic going on here. The rich among them were taking advantage of the poorer ones. They were taking advantage of this situation, as greedy people often will. And that's what was going on. The poor were being ultimately, whether directly or indirectly, it seems pretty direct to me, they were being oppressed and mistreated. And they reasoned that our flesh is as their flesh, of the flesh of our brothers. What they mean is we're the same as them. We're the same. Sure, I might not be as rich as them, but we're the same. We're brothers. Yeah, Dean, do you have something? Yeah. Problems can come from within, and many times those are the worst kinds. Or at least, from one perspective, it's extremely tragic because that should never happen. You know, that even if it's not actually objectively as severe it's more tragic because it should never happen. These problems from within. That what's going on here should never have even been able to happen. But it's happening. And so there was a great outcry. It's very reminiscent, as our book points out, of when the Hebrews were in Egypt and they cried out. And what do you remember? What came of that? When the Hebrews cried out, what does the text tell us? That God heard. He heard it, and then what did He do? He did something. He did something about it. That's what's going to happen here, except instead of God directly, I mean, God is still, overall, but Nehemiah hears of it, and he's going to do something. He was the governor, the leader, or both in this situation. The outcry came, Nehemiah heard, and he's going to do something about it. And he's going to do something quick. And we may see a different side of Nehemiah's personality in this, and we're going to continue to see a different side later on when Nehemiah comes back to Jerusalem near the end of the book of Nehemiah. And he sees some things that this is not going to cut it, and I'm going to do something about it right now. Well, we're going to see that come up right here. This is unacceptable. Something must be done. So, verse 6 says, I was very angry when I heard their outcry and these words. I took counsel with myself, and I brought charges against the nobles and the officials. I said to them, you are exacting interest, each from his brother. And I held a great assembly against them, and said to them, we, as far as we are able, have brought back our Jewish brothers who have been sold to the nations. But you even sell your brothers, that they may be sold to us. They were silent and could not find a word to say. So Nehemiah, according to the ESV, very angry. He's very angry. Yeah, Dean, go ahead. Yeah, which is to their credit. We'll see that here in just a second. Okay, so Nehemiah hears about it. He's angry. Now, at this point in his predicament, how many options did he have? Did he have, what do you think were his options? Is there anything else he could have done? He hears something that he doesn't like. He's very angry about it. What next? I'll tell you one option, okay? Nothing. Isn't that an option? Could have done nothing. He could have said, this has nothing to do with me. I'm not oppressing the poor. I'm not being oppressed by the rich. I'm going to mind my own business. Isn't that a maybe not reasonable, but at least a viable option? Sure. But he didn't do that. Would it have been right for him to do that? Probably not. Definitely not. Why? Yeah. Here's why he was right to not do that, is because the thing that was being done was wrong. So to be silent and to do nothing is basically enabling, at the very least. Something wrong was being done. And when I say wrong, not just morally wrong, but also explicitly contrary to the law of Moses. Was it wrong for the rich to lend money to the poor? Think twice before you answer, if that's a good enough hint. Is it wrong to lend money to the poor? Jewish poor? No. Yeah, see, what they were doing wrong was the thing that God explicitly said, you shall not do this. Lend them money and charge interest. Why would somebody lend money and charge interest? Why do you do that as a concept? What's the point? To make money. Hey, I'll loan you this $100, but you're going to pay me $150 back. Easy money. God said, you will not do that to your brethren. Period. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Also, the reasoning that if you are loaning a bunch of money, like if you're loaning to several people like a bank, you charge all of them interest, so that way, if say 1 in 10 doesn't pay back, the interest from the other 9 covers it.
It'll cover it. So safeguard also,
Yes.
which is both of which, on one hand may sound, well, that's just smart. That's just a smart thing to do. Well, yeah, from one perspective it is, but that doesn't make it right just because it's smart and is personally helpful doesn't mean it's right. But the main thing is God had said, do not do this. And that's exactly what Nehemiah finds out, one of the things that was going on here. No wonder he's angry. But here's one of the things that I think is the most powerful takeaway. He's angry. He hears about it. He's angry. And what's the first thing he does? According to I think so, the translations are different. Might say something a little bit different at the beginning of verse 7. What's that? I heard something, but I didn't. Okay, he thought about it. ESV, I kind of like, it says, I took counsel with myself. I consulted with myself, some say, after serious thought. I thought over this in my heart. One sort of paraphrase version here says, I after turning it over in my mind. So yeah, he thought about it. He thought with himself. He thought it over. That's such an important and overlooked step in decision making. Let me just think about this. So simple, and yet so neglected. Yeah, Dean? Yeah. Yeah, we already learned about him, at the beginning when we're first introduced to him, that was the kind of man he was. Whenever he heard about, it's almost like deja vu a little bit. He heard about the state of Jerusalem, and he wasn't very angry, he was just very heartbroken. So what did he do? Well, he thought a lot about it and it was really hurting him, but he also prayed. And then before he's going to go and potentially bring it up to the king, he prayed. And so, yeah, you're right. It doesn't explicitly say that he prayed, but based on what we know about him, there's a pretty significant chance that was a part of his counsel and thought process here. So, yeah, before he just jumped up and reacted on his anger, he thought about it. And surely at the very fundamental level of taking counsel with yourself in this context is, what should I do? What should be done? Would this be the right thing to do? Should I not say anything? Should I say something? And if I do say something, what should I say? Getting this all together, not indefinitely, to the point where, well, now it's too late and it will be weird to bring it up now, but just making sure that the right thing to be done is the thing that you're going to do. And it seems that he did. He decided, I've got to call these people out. These people need to be rebuked, because not only are they taking advantage of their brethren, but that's exactly that is something that God explicitly said, commanded, is sinful to do. Do not do this. So, I also found it interesting, at least in the ESV, it says, that he held a great assembly against them. Against them, whatever that might entail, to rebuke them. And he tries to reason with them, and like was already pointed out, to their credit, it says they were silent and could not find a word to say. Why do you think they couldn't find a word to say? They knew that he was right. That's why I say it's to their credit. Not only they knew it, they acknowledged it. So, I believe that many times, if not every time, when you can't find, today when people are maybe discussing something or debating something, and somebody's trying to defend something that they believe or think, and they have trouble letting it go, you hardly ever see people in today's climate remain silent and not find a word to say. They're going to find a word. They're going to say something, even if they can't find a word to say that adequately addresses what has been presented. They're going to say something, and you know what? 9.9 out of 10 times, whatever that thing that they say in that moment is ridiculous, silly, and ridiculous, and totally irrelevant. Because they're just defensive. They don't want to give up whatever it is. They're defensive. Maybe in this instance, it would have been because they were being called out for something they were actually doing. And maybe they got defensive and they didn't want to admit that they were doing something wrong. But to their credit, their silence, to me, is an admission of guilt. What can we say? It's kind of like Job. At the end of Job, when God finally, answers him in the whirlwind or however it's put, and he goes on and on and on, just kind of drilling Job with some, I guess, a very long rebuke in a way, and sort of in between he says, "You can keep going, but I'm not saying anything. I'm not going to say anything." Smart. That was wise. You know why he didn't say anything? Because he knew he had nothing. I have nothing to say. There's nothing I can say. So that's a credit to people, and people, that's a sign of honesty and humility within themselves. And that's what's lacking for many people today, not to mention just reason and common sense. They were addressed with the fact that they were violating God's law, in addition to, even if God hadn't commanded that, it would still not have been exactly, it should have been frowned upon. You're taking advantage of your poor brethren. And they seem to have accepted that. Couldn't find a word to say. And when you can't find a word to say, don't say any words. Best decision you can make. It goes on then in verse 9. It says, "So I said, the thing that you're doing is not good." This thing that you're doing is not good. There's the main point, the main thing. And on a foundational and fundamental level and a principle level, this is the thing that needs to be called out, regularly. This among brethren, especially. We'll say, at least especially. A brother is doing something that's not good. They need to be told that what they're doing is not good. You're helping them, and you're doing what Jesus said to do when you do that. So he says, this thing that you're doing is not good. You're doing something wrong. Ought you not to walk in the fear of our God, to prevent the taunts of the nations our enemies? What's that about? Where'd that come from? Prevent the taunts of our enemies? What's that got to do with anything? Okay. If, Paul talked about how there are certain things that Christians can do that will be a reproach on the name of Christ. I think Peter did too in one of his letters. The way we behave can bring reproach on Christ and his cause. Well, this is kind of what he's saying here. The way that you're behaving is reflecting on God in a way, and it's certainly giving our enemies fodder to cast charge against us or to taunt us, as the word is used there in the ESV. So there are here's another good example of how sin has a ripple effect of consequences at times, or at least it's like skipping a rock across a pond, and you got, once it first hits, that's like the initial impact, but then it has lots of little skips across. It's not just I sinned and this is the consequence. This is the one thing. But there are other, kind of like shrapnel, lesser or secondary consequences. And that was one of them that Nehemiah is calling out. It's not just that you're hurting them, but look what you're doing is causing. It's hurting our reputation. It's giving our enemies something to grasp onto against us, and so on. Moreover, verse 10, he says, I and my brothers and my servants are lending them money and grain. Let us abandon this exacting of interest. I meant to point out, 1 Corinthians 6 is such a similar or parallel situation that Paul was dealing with at Corinth whenever the brethren were suing each other. They were getting in disputes that they couldn't settle amongst themselves, so they were actually taking each other to a heathen court, a pagan court. So we have a Christian and a Christian suing each other and going to a pagan Gentile court. What do you think that all the Gentiles involved in that situation will think about the Christians, the church? Yeah, these are the real good people that we're supposed to be. They can't even get along. Why would I want to be a part of that? They're fighting with each other. They don't even like each other, and they're no better than anybody else. Well, Paul points out that, if I can find the exact verse he says here. Well, not going to look much longer. But at any rate, he's suggesting the reproach that brings and the danger that there is in doing that, the way you behave when you're against each other, and the consequences of that. And that's the secondary thing. I call it a secondary thing that Nehemiah is alluding to. So he says this has to stop. Let us abandon this exacting of interest. No more interest. And then he says in verse 11, return to them this very day their fields, their vineyards, their olive orchards, and their houses, and the percentage of money, grain, wine, and oil that you've been exacting from them. So not only are you going to stop doing it from this moment forward, you're going to return to them everything that you've already taken as interest and exacted from them. Today. None of this, well, give me some time to work it back up, and get the extra. Let me get on a payment plan. I mean, maybe there was a time lapse, but at least it was going to begin this very day. This very day. You will return to them. If they mortgage their field to you, you're giving it back today. Vineyard, giving it back. House, giving it back. Today. Then they said, we will restore these and require nothing from them, and we will do as you say. And I called the priests and made them swear to do as they had promised. I also shook out the fold of my garment and said, so may God shake out every man from his house and from his labor who does not keep this promise, so he may be shaken out and emptied. And all the assembly said amen and praised Jehovah, and the people did as they had promised. Mission success, mission accomplished. They listened, they acknowledged, they took it, they accepted. Nehemiah, you're right. Didn't seem to put up much of a fight. They acknowledged that what they were doing was in fact wrong, and they vowed to change it. Yes, go ahead.
Zacchaeus
Mm-hmm.
The wondrous thing is that Jesus said nothing. It's just stood up and said.
That he said nothing, is that what you said?
That
Jesus didn't say anything?
What you are doing is that he was just a guest.
Yeah.
And people were criticizing him.
Well, didn't Zacchaeus also say that if ever I have accidentally,
Right.
yeah.
Yes, it's a wonderful thing.
Yeah. Yeah, he was one of the few that, I guess, had a conscience. Morally, he didn't, a lot of people, I understand, is they would pursue that job to extort people. Zacchaeus was of a different sort. Yeah, he didn't seek to rip people off. And if he ever found out that he did by accident, he returned it fourfold, he said. Good for him. And good for these people. It's sad that they even did it in the first place. Which, by the way, they learned it from somewhere, don't you think? What they were doing, they learned it, they got it from somewhere. It's not like they were saying, well, we've never done this before and the law of Moses says not to do it, but we're going to do it anyway. They're probably just doing what the normal thing was. This is the norm. The norm. And everybody knows that once something is the norm, that means it's automatically okay with God. Right? Well, that's what people would have you think. Once it's the norm, it's accepted. The reason that is so widely the case is because generally people have fallen into that. Once it's the norm, everybody pretty much accepts it. And that was probably the norm. Or else God would have had no reason to say, no, don't do this to your brethren. But the key is they changed what they were doing. They agreed, and not just changed what they were doing, they agreed, just like Zacchaeus, well, not even quite as Zacchaeus did it, they agreed to give it back. Whatever they had exacted from them, they were to give back. They praised God, and they did as they promised. What's all this shaking out the garment business? Kind of reminds me of what Jesus told the apostles to do when they went around preaching. If somebody doesn't hear you, go out, shake the dust off of your feet or whatever, and as a sign to them, and actually pronounce. You know, that was like a symbolic gesture in a way. And Nehemiah just kind of spells it out. He goes ahead and he explains the gesture itself. It says, "So may God shake out every man from his house and from his labor who doesn't keep his promise." You promised, you swore, so if you don't keep it, you will answer to God. Dean, do you have something?
I don't know, it's like symbolic, and put back then, basically, you made an oath, you had to carry it out. If you did, you know.
Yeah. This comes back to the, sadly, no longer widespread custom of what you say matters. Your word means something. So today, people would be fine with swearing anything, and even if they have no intention of ever doing it. It hasn't always been that way. Sadly, it should still be that way. If I say I'm going to do something, I ought to do it. Even if I spoke rashly, and I'm not talking about swearing to do something sinfully, but if I said I'm going to do something, even if the next day or even the next second, I'm like, I wish I hadn't said that. I wish I hadn't have said I would do that. Too bad. You did say it. Learn from this, right? This is the advice I would give to somebody in my family or something. I understand that you don't really want to go do the thing that you don't want to go today or whatever, but you said you were going to. So learn. Next time, don't say you're going to do something. It's so simple. Just don't say it. And that's not even taking into consideration the gravity of an oath, a formal oath or swearing that you're going to do something. But just saying you're going to do something should mean something, and people should know when that person says they're going to do something, I don't have to think about it twice. I know they're going to do it because of your reputation. And yet, sometimes people need a little bit of push or boost, if you will, and Nehemiah was going to hold them to this. I want you to swear that you will do this. And they did. And then they said amen, and praise God. So, problem averted. That it doesn't mean that everything was, great immediately, but at least that problem had been resolved. Now we learn a little bit more about Nehemiah for the rest of the chapter. It says, moreover, from the time that I was appointed to be their governor, here's an example of Nehemiah's character in general that would also bolster his brethren to be better, to do better, to be people of integrity. He was not a hypocrite. He says, from the time that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year to the 32nd year of Artaxerxes the king, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the food allowance of the governor. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Sounds like Daniel to me, just different reasons. The former governors who were before me laid heavy burdens on the people and took from them for their daily ration 40 shekels of silver. Even their servants lorded it over the people. But I did not do so because of the fear of God. I also persevered in the work on this wall, and we acquired no land, and all my servants were gathered there for the work. Okay, so Nehemiah just points out that while he was governor, from the time he was appointed, he was not going, there were some perks to this position. And among those perks was getting a food allowance from the king. Now, we mentioned the possible translation or meaning of the word famine in the earlier verse, but, maybe it is referring to an actual, traditional actual famine that's going on in the land. In that case especially, it makes it even more powerful that Nehemiah refused to take this food allowance. Why would he do that? So we know Daniel refused it because he didn't want to risk, or he didn't want to partake of he didn't want to become defiled, it seems, from the food. He wanted to just play it safe and just eat the vegetables. But what about Nehemiah in his case? What do you think? Yeah, Dean?
Maybe when it said example.
Okay.
A lot of times, they look for the leaders to set the example, set the proper example. And if the leaders do not set the proper example, then they're not going to follow the same leader. So he set the proper example before the example.
Okay, yeah, sure, for sure there's an example there. Powerful example. Yeah. Okay, so there's an indirect maybe consequence of, somebody paid for that food, or somebody's going to have to pay for it. Yeah, I didn't even consider that aspect. Here's another thing. Remember when David was trying to trap Uriah into believing that that Bathsheba's baby was his? He brought him home, and he was trying to get him to, go lay with his wife. But he didn't. Why did he say he didn't? Why wouldn't he? Okay, it was right, but what was...
Because my people, my soldiers are on the fence, and am I going to...
Exactly. He said, my men don't have this luxury to come home to their wives. They're out there in the, wherever. They can't come home to be with their wives, so I'm not going to go home to my wife. So he slept outside on the door, or on the porch, we might call it, or something like that. I think that's a similar thing that Nehemiah is doing here. My people don't have this food allowance, so I'm not going to accept this food allowance. And like Wayne said, like Dean and Wayne said, yeah, there's a strong example there. But also maybe there was something to it about this is unintentionally or indirectly going to be a burden on the people. But also, he points out the men who were governor before me, they actually directly laid heavy burdens on the people and took from them for their daily ration 40 shekels of silver. So they were getting money from the people on a daily basis. I did not do that. Why? He says why. I didn't lord over the people. I haven't lorded over the people because of the fear of God. Such a simple and yet infinitely profound concept. I do not do this because I fear God. I'm not going to do this thing. And the list that could go on this list is endless, because I fear God. This is something that many are lacking today. This concept, this principle of to do this thing would be tantamount to admitting or exhibiting a lack of the fear of God. It does have something to do with God. What do you mean, Nehemiah? Just continuing the tradition of the governors before you, taking your rightful food allowance and taking your rightful money, income as governor, and exercising your God-given authority over the people would be wrong? And something other than the fear of God? According to Nehemiah, it would. I did not do this because of the fear of God. Should start with the fear of God pretty much, every time. He says, I also persevered in the work on this wall, and we acquired no land. So I also didn't get any land. And all my servants were gathered there for the work. Moreover, they were at my table, 150 men, Jews and officials, besides those who came to us from the nations that were around us. Now what was prepared at my expense for each day was 1 ox and 6 choice sheep and birds, and every 10 days all kinds of wine in abundance. Yet for all this I did not demand the food allowance of the governor, because the service was too heavy on this people. So there you go again. Like Wayne mentioned, at least it did come back to the people, and a burden that would, some sort of burden that would come back to them. Remember for my good, O my God, and all that I have done for this people. Just sort of a little prayer on top of all of what he's just talked about. Remember me for good, according to all that I've done for this people. And guess what? Not only has God remembered him, but we are too. We're talking about it right now. All right. The difficulties we face in life will come from various sources. We expect it from without, but the main thing that we should strive to make sure is that it never comes from within. And now it's easier said than done, because we're people. And, I've quoted Jerry Barber many times, and one of his quotes is, as long as the church will have problems, as long as the church has people. Because that's just, sadly, the way it goes sometimes. That's not to say that it's acceptable. Well, we're just human, so don't get all torn up about it. No, wrong is wrong. Psalmist said, it is better to take refuge in Jehovah than to trust in man. It is better to take refuge in Jehovah than to trust in princes. Putting our trust in God is the best solution to pretty much every problem. Men will disappoint us at times, but God will never disappoint us. And finally, those who wish to be leaders can learn very much from Nehemiah and the way he handled this. And and as a close, just remind us, he was very angry, but the first thing he did was, I took counsel with myself. Maybe to check himself, make sure that before he moved forward, he was going to do the right thing. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah. Job learned that lesson hard, and his wife, I still think that would have been one of the hardest hitting things that he had to endure, with his own wife just not being a help to him or support, but just saying, just curse God and die. Sad. Tragic, really. But he trusted in God. He had an awful lot to say, wondering why this was happening, but all of that was grounded in his trust of God, because he knew that something isn't right here. And again, he never turned his back on God, but he trusted God, and it was all straightened out.